Okay, guys, let's see what happens next. Chapter 17. Mrs. Driver was short with Cramp Frill that evening. She would not sit down and drink with him as usual, but stumped about the kitchen, looking at him sideways every now and again out of the corners of her eyes. He seemed uneasy, as indeed he was. There was a kind of menace in her silence, a hidden something which no one could ignore. Even Aunt Sophie had felt it when Mrs. Driver brought up her wine. She heard it in the clink of the decanter against the glass as Mrs. Driver set down the tray, and in the rattle of the wooden rings as Mrs. Driver drew the curtains. It was in the tremble of the floorboards as Mrs. Driver crossed the room, and in the click of the latch as Mrs. Driver closed the door. "What's the matter with her now?" Aunt Sophie wondered vaguely as delicately, ungreedily she poured the first glass. The boy had felt it too, from the way Mrs. Driver had stared at him and as he sat hunched in the bath, from the way she soaped the sponge and the way she said, "And now." She had scrubbed him slowly with a careful, angry steadiness, and all through the bathing time she did not say a word. When he was in bed, she had gone through all his things, peering into the cupboards and opening his drawers. She had pulled his suitcase out from under the wardrobe and found his dear dead mole and his hoard of sugar lumps and her best potato knife. But even then she had not spoken. She had thrown the mole into the waste paper basket and had made angry noises with her tongue. She pocketed the potato knife and all the sugar lumps. She had stared at him a moment before she turned the gas low. A strange stare it had been, more puzzled than accusing. Mrs. Driver slept above the scullery. She had her own back stairs. That night she did not undress. She set the alarm clock for midnight and put it where the tick would not disturb her. Outside her door, she unbuttoned her tight shoes and crawled grunting a little under the eiderdown. She had barely closed her eyes, as she told Cramp Frill afterwards, when the clock shrilled off, chattering and rattling on its four thin legs, on the bare boards of the passageway. Mrs. Driver tumbled herself out of bed and fumbled her way to the door. "Shush," she said to the clock as she felt for the catch. "Shush," and she clasped it to her chest. She stood there in her stockinged feet at the head of the scullery stairs. Something, it seemed, had flickered below, a hint of light. Mrs. Driver peered down the dark curve of the narrow stairway. Yes, there it was again, a moth-wing flutter. A candlelight, that's what it was. A moving candle, beyond the stairs, beyond the scullery. Somewhere within the kitchen. Clock in hand, Mrs. Driver creaked down the stairs in her stockinged feet, panting a little in her eagerness. There seemed a sigh in the darkness, an echo of movement, and it seemed to Mrs. Driver, standing there on the cold stone flags of the scullery, that this sound, that was barely a sound, could only mean one thing, the soft swing-to of the green baize door, the door which led out of the kitchen into the main hall beyond. Hurriedly, Mrs. Driver felt her way into the kitchen and fumbled for matches along the ledge above the stove. She knocked off a pepper pot and a paper bag of cloves, and glancing quickly downwards, saw a filament of light. She saw it in the second before she struck a match. A thread of light, it looked like, on the floor beside her feet. It ran in an oblong shape, outlining a rough square. Mrs. Driver gasped and lit the gas, and the room leapt up around her. She glanced quickly at the baize door. There seemed to her startled eye a quiver of movement in it, as though it had just swung open. She ran to it and pushed it open, but the passage beyond was still and dark. No flicker of shadow nor sound of distant footfall. She left the door fall to again and watched it as it swung back slowly, regretfully held by its heavy spring. Yes, that was the sound she had heard from the scullery, that sighing whisper, like an indrawn breath. Cautiously, clutching back her skirts, Mrs. Driver moved toward the stove. An object lay there, something pinkish on the floor beside the jutting board. Ah, she realized, that board. That was where the light had come from. She hesitated and glanced. My camera keeps falling down. And glanced about the kitchen. Everything else looked normal and just as she had left it. The plates on the dresser, the saucepans on the wall, and the row of tea towels hanging symmetrically on their string above the stove. The pinkish object she saw now was a heart-shaped cacio box, one that she knew well from the glassed-in tray table beside the fireplace in the drawing room. She picked it up. It was enamel and gold and set with tiny brilliants. "Well, she began, and stooping swiftly with a sudden angry movement, she wrenched back the piece of floor. And then she shrieked, loud and long. She saw movement, a running, a scrambling, a fluttering. She heard a squeaking, a jabbering, and a gasping. Little people they looked like, with hands and feet, and mouths opening. That's what they looked like. But they couldn't be that, of course. Running here, there, and everywhere. "Oh, oh, oh!" she shrieked, and felt behind her for a chair. She clambered onto it and wobbled beneath her, and she climbed, still shrieking, from the chair to the table. And there she stood, marooned, crying and gasping and calling out for help until, after hours it seemed, there was a rattling at the scullery door. Crampfurl it was, roused at last by the light and the noise. "What is it?" he called. "Let me in." But Mrs. Driver would not leave the table. "A nest! A nest!" she shouted, "alive and squeaking." Crampfurl threw his weight against the door and burst open the lock. He staggered slightly dazed into the kitchen, his corduroy trousers pulled on over his nightshirt. "Where?" he cried, his eyes wide beneath his tousled hair. "What sort of a nest?" Mrs. Driver, sobbing still with fright, pointed at the door. Crampfurl walked over it in his slow, deliberate way and stared down. He saw a hole in the floor, lined and cluttered with small objects. Children's toys, they looked like, bits of rubbish, that was all. "It's nothing," he said after a moment. "It's that boy, that's what it is." He stirred the contents with his foot, and all the partitions fell down. "There ain't nothing alive in there." "But I saw them, I tell you," gasped Mrs. Driver. "Little people, like with hands, or mice dressed up." Crampfurl stared into the hole. "Mice dressed up?" he repeated uncertainly. "Hundreds of them," went on Mrs. Driver, "running and squeaking. I saw them, I tell you." "Well, there ain't nothing there now," said Crampfurl, and he gave a final stare around with his boot. "Then they've run away," she cried, "under the floor, up inside the walls. The place is alive with them." "Well," said Crampfurl stolidly, "maybe. But if you ask me, I think it's that boy, where he hides things." His eye brightened, and he went down on one knee. "Where's he got the ferret? I shouldn't wonder." "Listen," cried Mrs. Driver, and there was a despairing note in her voice. "You've got to listen. That wasn't no boy, and it wasn't no ferret." She reached for the back of the chair and lowered herself clumsily onto the floor. She came beside him on the edge of the hole. "They had hands and faces, I tell you. Look," she said, pointing. "See that? It's a bed. And now I come to think of it, one of 'em was in it." "Now you come to think of it," said Crampfurl. "Yes," went on Mrs. Driver firmly, "and there's something else I come to think of. Remember that girl, Rosa Pickhatchet? The one that was simple? Well, simple or not, she saw one on the drawing room mantelpiece with a beard." "One what?" asked Crampfurl. Mrs. Driver glared at him. "What I've been telling you about. One of these..." "Mice dressed up?" asked Crampfurl. "Not mice," Mrs. Driver almost shouted. "Mice don't have beards." "But you said," began Crampfurl. "Yes, I know I said it. Not that these had beards, but what would you call them? What could they be but mice?" "Not so loud," whispered Crampfurl. "You'll wake the house up." "They can't hear," said Mrs. Driver. "Not through the baize door." She went to the stove and picked up the fire tongs. "And what if they do? We ain't done nothing. Move over," she went on, "and let me get at that hole." One by one, Mrs. Driver picked things out, with many shocked gasps, cries of amazement, and did you evers. She made 2 piles on the floor, one of valuables and one of what she called rubbish. Curious objects dangled from the tongs. Would you believe it? Her best lace handkerchiefs. "Look, here's another, and my big mattress needle. I knew I had one. My silver thimble, if you please, and one of hers. And look, oh my, at the wools, the cottons. No wonder you can never find a spool of white cotton if you want one. Potatoes, nuts. Look at this, a pot of caviar." "Caviar!" No, it's too much. It really is. Dolls, chairs, tables, and look at all this blotting paper. So that's where it goes. Oh, my goodness gracious, she cried suddenly, her eyes staring. What is this? Mrs. Driver laid down the tongs and leaned over the hole, tentatively and fearfully, as though afraid of being stung. It's a watch, an emerald watch, her watch, and she's never even missed it. Her voice rose. And it's going. Look, you can see by the kitchen clock, 25 past 12. Mrs. Driver sat down suddenly on a hard chair. Her eyes were staring and her face looked white and flabby as though deflated. You know what this means, she said to Crampfurl. No, he said. The police, said Mrs. Driver. That's what this means, a case for the police. Chapter 18. The boy lay, trembling a little, beneath the bedclothes. The screwdriver was under his mattress. He had heard the alarm clock. He had heard Mrs. Driver exclaim on the stairs, and he had run. The candle on the table beside his bed still smelt a little, and the wax must still be warm. He lay there waiting, but they did not come upstairs. After hours, it seemed, he heard the hall clock strike 1. All seemed quiet below, and at last he slipped out of bed and crept along the passage to the head of the stairway. There he sat for a while, shivering a little, and gazing downstairs into the darkened hall. There was no sound but the steady tick of the clock, and occasionally that shuffle or whisper which might be wind, but which, as he knew, was the sound of the house itself, the sigh of the tired floors and the ache of knotted wood. So quiet was that at last he found courage to move and to tiptoe down the staircase and along the kitchen passage. He listened a while outside the baize door, and at length, very gently, he pushed it open. The kitchen was silent and filled with grayish darkness. He felt, as Mrs. Driver had done, along the shelf for the matches, and he struck a light. He saw the gaping hole in the floor and the objects piled beside it, and in the same flash he saw a candle on the shelf. He lit it clumsily with trembling hands. Yes, there they lay, the contents of the little home, higgledy-piggledy on the boards, and the tongs lay beside them. Mrs. Driver had carried away all she considered valuable and had left the rubbish. And rubbish it looked, thrown down like this: balls of wool, old potatoes, odd pieces of dolls' furniture, matchboxes, cotton spools, crumpled squares of blotting paper. He knelt down. The house itself was a shambles. Partitions fallen, earth floors revealed, where Pod had dug down to give greater height to the rooms. Matchsticks, an old cogwheel, onion skins, scattered bottle tops. The boy stared, blinking his eyelids and tilting the candle so that the grease ran hot on his hand. Then he got up from his knees and, crossing the kitchen on tiptoe, he closed the scullery door. He came back to the hole, and leaning down, he called softly, "Arrietty! Arrietty!" After a while, he called again. Something else fell hot on his hand. It was a tear from his eye. Angrily, he brushed it away, and leaning farther into the hole, he called once more. "Pod," he whispered, "homily." They appeared so quietly that at first, in the wavering light of the candle, he did not see them. Silent, they stood, looking up at him with scared white faces from what had been the passage outside the storerooms. "Where have you been?" asked the boy. Pod cleared his throat. "Up at the end of the passage, under the clock." "I've got to get you out," said the boy. "Where to?" asked Pod. "I don't know. What about the attic?" "That ain't no good," said Pod. "I heard them talking. They're going to get the police and a cat and the sanitary inspector and the rat catcher from the town hall at Leighton Buzzard." They were all silent. Little eyes stared at big eyes. "There won't be nowhere in the house that's safe," Pod said at last, and no one moved. "What about the doll's house on the top shelf in the schoolroom?" suggested the boy. "Even a cat can't get there." Homily gave a little moan of assent. "Yes," she said, "the doll's house." "No," said Pod in the same expressionless voice. "You can't live on a shelf. Maybe the cat can't get up, but no more can't you get down. You're stuck. You've got to have water." "I'd bring you water," said the boy, "and there are beds and things here." He touched the pile of rubbish. No, said Pod, a shelf ain't no good. Besides, you'll be going soon, or so they say. Oh, Pod, pleaded Homily in a husky whisper. There's stairs in the dollhouse, and 2 bedrooms, and a dining room, and a kitchen, and a bathroom, she said. But it's up by the ceiling, Pod explained wearily. You've got to eat, haven't you, he asked, and drink. Yes, Pod, I know. But there ain't no buts, said Pod. He drew a long breath. We've got to emigrate, he said. Oh, moaned Homily softly, and Arrietty began to cry. Now don't take on, said Pod in a tired voice. Arrietty had covered her face with her hands, and her tears ran through her fingers. The boy, watching, saw them glisten in the candlelight. I'm not taking on, she gasped. I'm so happy. You mean, said the boy to Pod, but with one eye on Arrietty, you'll go to the Badger set? He, too, felt a mounting excitement. Where else? Asked Pod. Oh, my goodness gracious, moaned Homily, and sat down on the broke matchbox chest of drawers. But you've got to go somewhere tonight, said the boy. You've got to go somewhere before tomorrow morning. Oh, my goodness gracious, moaned Homily again. He's right at that, said Pod. Can't cross them fields in the dark. Bad enough getting across them in daylight. I know, cried Arrietty. Her wet face glistened in the candlelight. It was light and tremulous, and she raised her arms a little as though about to fly, and she swayed as she balanced on her toe tips. Let's go to the doll's house just for tonight and tomorrow. She closed her eyes against the brightness of the vision. Tomorrow the boy will take us. Take us, and she could not say to where. Take us, cried Homily in a strange, hollow voice. How? In his pockets, chanted Arrietty. Won't you? Again she swayed with lighted, upturned face. Yes, he said, and bring the luggage up afterwards in a fish basket. Oh, my goodness, moaned Homily. I'll pick all the furniture out of this pile here, or most of it. They'll hardly notice. And anything else you want. Tea, murmured Homily. Enough for our lifetimes. All right, said the boy. I'll get a pound of tea. And coffee, too, if you like. And cooking pots and matches. You'll be all right, he said. But what do they eat? Wailed Homily. Caterpillars? Now, Homily, said Pod, don't be foolish. Loopy was always a good manager. But Loopy isn't there, said Homily. Berries? Do they cook berries? How do they cook? Out of doors? Now, Homily, said Pod, we'll see all that when we get there. I couldn't light a fire of sticks, said Homily. Not in the wind. What if it rains? She asked. How do they cook in the rain? Now, Homily, began Pod. He was beginning to lose patience, but Homily rushed on. Could you get us a couple of tins of sardines to take, she asked the boy, and some salt, and some candles, and matches, and could you bring us the carpets from the doll's house? Yes, said the boy, I could. Of course I could. Anything you want. All right, said Homily. She still looked wild, partly because some of her hair had rolled out of the curlers, but she seemed appeased. How are you going to get us upstairs, up to the schoolroom? The boy looked down at his pocketless nightshirt. I'll carry you, he said. How? Asked Homily. In your hands? Yes, said the boy. I'd rather die, said Homily. I'd rather stay right here and be eaten by the rat catcher from the town hall at Leighton Buzzard. The boy stood round the kitchen. He seemed bewildered. Shall I carry you in a clothespin bag? He asked at last, seeing it hanging in his usual place on the handle of the scullery door. All right, said Homily. Take out the clothespins first. But she walked into it bravely enough when he laid it out on the floor. It was soft and floppy and made of woven raffia. When he picked it up, Homily shrieked and clung to Pod and Arrietty. Oh, she gasped as the bag swayed a little. Oh, I can't. Stop it. Put me out. Oh. And clutching and slipping, they fell into a tangle at the bottom. Be quiet, Homily, can't you? Exclaimed Pod angrily, and he held her tightly by the ankle. It was not easy to control her, as he was laying on his back with his face pushed forward on his chest and one leg held upright by the side of the bag, somewhere above his head. Arrietty climbed up away from them, clinging to the knots of raffia, and looked out over the edge. Oh, I can't, cried Homily. Stop it, Pod, I'm dying. Tell him to put us down. Put us down, said Pod in his patient way, just for a moment. That's right, on the floor. And as once again the bag was placed beside the hole, they all ran out. Look here, said the boy unhappily to Homily, you've got to try. She'll try all right, said Pod. Give her a breather and take it slower, if you see what I mean. All right, agreed the boy, but there isn't much time. Come on, he said nervously. Hop in. Listen, cried Pod sharply, and froze. The boy, looking down, saw their 3 upturned faces catching the light. Like pebbles they looked, still and stony against the darkness within the hole, and then in a flash they were gone. The boards were empty, and the hole was bare. He leaned into it. Pod, he called in a frantic whisper. Homily, come back. And then he, too, became frozen, stooped and rigid above the hole. The scullery door creaked open behind him. It was Mrs. Driver. She stood there silent, this time in her nightdress. Turning, the boy stared up at her. Hello, he said uncertainly after a moment. She did not smile, but something lightened her eyes, a malicious gleam, a look of triumph. She carried a candle which shone upwards on her face, streaking it strangely with light and shadow. What are you doing down here? She asked. He stared at her, but he did not speak. Answer me, she said. And what are you doing with the clothespin bag? Still he stared at her almost stupidly. The clothespin bag? He repeated and looked down as though surprised to see it in his hand. Nothing, he said. Was it you who put the watch in this hole? No, he said, staring up at her again. It was there already. Ah, she said and smiled, so you knew it was there. No, he said. I mean, yes. Do you know what you are? Asked Mrs. Driver, watching him closely. You are a sneaking, thieving, noxious little dribbit of no good. His face quivered. Why? He said. You know why. You're a wicked, black-hearted, fribbling little pickpocket. That's what you are, and so are they. They're nasty little, crafty, scampy, scurvy, squeaking little... No, they're not, he put in quickly. And you're in a league with them. She came across to him, and taking him by the upper arm, she jerked him to his feet. You know what they do with thieves? She asked. No, he said. They lock them up. That's what they do with thieves, and that's what's going to happen to you. I'm not a thief, cried the boy, his lips trembling. I'm a borrower. A what? She swung him round by tightening the grip of his arm. A borrower, he repeated. There were tears on his eyelids. He hoped they would not fall. So that's what you call it, she exclaimed, as he had done so long ago. It seemed now, that day with Arrietty. That's their name, he said, the kind of people they are. They're borrowers. Borrowers, eh? She repeated Mrs. Driver wonderingly. She laughed. Well, they've done all the borrowing they're ever going to do in this house. She began to drag them toward the door. The tears spilled over his eyelids and ran down his cheeks. Don't hurt them, he begged. I'll move them, I promise. I know how. Mrs. Driver laughed again and pushed him roughly through the green baize door. They'll be moved all right, she said. Don't worry. The rat catcher will know how. Cramp Frill's old cat will know how. So will the sanitary inspector and the fire brigade if need be. The police will know how, I shouldn't wonder. No need to worry about moving them. Once you've found the nest, she went on, dropping her voice to a vicious whisper as they passed Aunt Sophie's door. The rest is easy. She pushed him into the schoolroom and locked the door, and he heard the boards of the passage creak beneath her tread as, satisfied, she moved away. He crept into bed then because he was cold and cried his heart out under the blankets.